With your host, Adrian Younge.
Why is music so important to me? I've asked this question to myself as I'm a very analytical person. Given the fact that I have a law degree, my brain had been reprogrammed to demand finality when it came to the synchronicity of feeling and reason. If I felt a certain way, I had to have an explanation for it. And with time, research, and practice, I finally found the word that epitomized my sonic adulation, my passion for melody, my love for vinyl, my musical lust. That word is freedom. True music is an expression of identity, a portal that reveals where we're going, but at the same time where we were at. An answer to a new felt need that had not existed before, an identifying piece of art that allows you to locate an individual within the context of their time. It's like an incantation of manumission when the man is on a mission to restrict your social agility. Your socio-economic position, as Archie Shepp noted when describing record labels owned by white males. You own the music, and we make it. But don't misinterpret the meaning behind the product versus the meaning of producing or creating the music. Why? Because music is freedom. Equality equals freedom. And freedom serves as the linchpin of the Black consciousness movement. It's manumission. And for the Black community, it unequivocally binds us with formidability. A strength that allows us to push back against conformity, a revolution of sorts, as the miseducation of Black America can't hold us back forever. Now, Sidney Bechet, a really ill soloist, one of the first recognized jazz improv cats in America, has an autobiography. It's called Treat It Gentle. And I want to read you an excerpt from this autobiography. It says, "After emancipation, all those people who had been slaves, they needed the music more than ever now. It was like they were trying to find out in this music what they were supposed to do with this freedom. Playing the music and listening to it, waiting for it to express what they needed to learn once they had learned. It wasn't just white people the music had to reach, nor even to their own people, but straight out to life, and to what a man does with his life when it is finally his." Now, I say all this because it really resonates with me as a musician. And when I think about the evolution of Black music in America, we're going from Negro spiritual to the blues to jazz and beyond. We use music to bring us closer to freedom. We found a new identity and a purpose in indicting the American idea of what freedom is supposed to be. We flattened the fifth and diatonically broke the walls of Western harmony to create our own music called jazz. We rebelled, and in the post-civil rights era, my next guest is part of a duo that changed the way jazz spoke to the people. They satisfied an intense thirst on the part of colored youth to develop a contextualized history and theoretical framework to counteract America's deferred commitment to equality. They were Public Enemy before Public Enemy. They were teenagers way ahead of their time. With words and music, they proved that the revolution would not be televised, that it's winter in America, and that you are beautiful when you are who you are. Please welcome Gil Scott-Heron's partner, friend, producer, writer, and co-collaborator on some of the greatest Black music created in the 20th century, my brother, Mr. Brian Jackson. How you doing, man?
Hey, man. Wow. After that, all I can do is just say thank you, man. And I'm happy to be on Invisible Blackness with you, brother.
All good, man. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, man. Ever since, we met, I always felt like we were very, very kindred spirits. And I just love talking with you, man, because there's so much insight. It's when I speak to you, I feel as though I'm seeing a reflection of myself, because my favorite music was at the time when you were making a lot of your favorite music, in the 60s and the 70s. And I don't know, I just feel like I'm exactly you at that time. Like I was just born. I was mistakenly born later. You know what I'm saying?
You totally were, man. I feel like I was probably born a little too early, Oh, and it's funny that you said that, because I was just about to tell you that you remind me of myself,
Oh, wow.
when I was younger, so totally into the music, and so totally so solely about music.
You co-wrote and or arranged nearly 10 albums over an 8-year period, 7 of which you also co-produced, including Pieces of a Man, Free Will, Winter in America, Midnight Band's First Minute of a New Day. From South Africa to South Carolina, It's Your World. It's quite apparent that you've firmly contributed to the consciousness of people of color around the world. How does this feel, and does this passion ever dissipate?
Well, it was really the consciousness of our people that contributed in the largest part to our contribution.
Mm.
We always saw ourselves as part of a continuum, a bubble in the wave, if you will. And so we were just following the tradition of those who came before us, the tradition of spreading news, the tradition of sharing teachings and being a spiritual true north for our people. That was kind of the role of the African griot.
Mm.
Folks like Oscar Brown Jr., Amiri Baraka, Langston Hughes. The difference, I think, between what I feel now and what I felt 50 years ago is that back then, my complete focus was on learning. And 50 years later, my focus is still on learning, but it's also on sharing what I've learned during that learning process.
That's deep, because I think about the debut album Pieces of a Man in 71, and the music came out at a time when we were thick in Vietnam. We had a racist president in Nixon. This is the post-civil rights era, where Congress recently passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, just a lot of federal legislation aimed at ending legal segregation, or at least better masking the vestige of America's Black codes or Jim Crow laws, And,
Mm-hmm.
At the time, we were still disproportionately suffering, but we were entering an era where major steps were taken to help us on our journey. So, do you feel that Black people needed the music now more than ever? Since, like Bashé said in my earlier monologue, Black people were trying to find out what to do with this freedom. And also, your album came out the same year as What's Going On. So, did you feel like the music was a visceral reaction to newfound forms of freedom?
Totally. I mean, we had already started hearing some of the ways that Black consciousness could be manifested through art.
Mm.
And we understood, I think at that point, that music, as well as the other art forms, were a tool in organizing and education. I mean, let's go back to, if you want to go back through history, let's take a backward look at how Black music evolved. A lot of people say that jazz and blues, etc., the gospel, all came from the slave chants, from the field holler,
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that many folks have missed about those songs that were created during slavery was that there were messages in them. There were messages in them about when to organize, about how to organize. We had a whole language, and that comes from the tradition of the talking drum.
Mm.
This is one of the reasons that the drum was taken away from us when we arrived here, because it was a form of communication. We could organize. We could organize rebellion. We could tell news of each other's families that we had been separated from. These were the kind of things that we were using music for. And so that was a huge part of the tradition. Our music has always been like a telephone wire.
That's deep, man. I think about the way that you guys communicated to the people. I think about what it was like to be, because you guys both were creating in New York. And I think about what it was like to be a young man at that time. And we always look at New York, we always look at California as the bastion for liberalist views, like we could speak how we want to, but people have always sensationalized these opposite coasts in a way where there's an argument that it wasn't that racist. But then when you go back and you think about New York and how New York came to be New York, there's very deep racial components ingrained within its nucleus, because New York was the financial center of America. Why? Because the slave trade was its primary asset. Wall Street financed the slave trade. That's where the biggest slave depot was in America. And there was all these ancillary businesses around it. And yes, New York historically had abolition groups, but it also had a contingent of people that were staunchly against abolition, because the city's economy, its ports, its banks were all heavily tied to slavery. And when I think about the ideology of this discriminatory sentiment within New York, I think about during the Civil War, after the Civil War, all the riots, all the murders against Black people, because Black people were blamed for this bloodiest war, which is our Civil War, right? And then I fast forward to people like Robert Moses, that were the master planners of New York, that made sure that the Bronx and other areas within Brooklyn were segregated to keep the poor and or the immigrants in these areas and keep the richer protected in these certain areas over here. And then I fast forward this now to 64. Let's go a year before the Voting Rights Act was passed. This is Brian Jackson, Gil Scott, young men in New York developing their Black idiom, developing their voice. And there was a poll I saw, a New York Times poll, where they interviewed a bunch of white people in New York. And then they concluded that, these white people concluded that the civil rights movement, okay, this is before Voting Rights Act even was enacted. The civil rights movement had gone too far. They asserted that Black people were receiving everything on a silver platter, and they called everything regarding the civil rights movement reverse discrimination against whites. And nearly half of those polls said picketing and demonstrations hurt Black people's cause. So you were raised in New York in this during this time frame. How real was the Black Power movement in the streets of New York, and what did this kind of racism feel like in a place that has always been deemed as a liberal city?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that time period, from the time I was about 11 years old, when I encountered one of my schoolmates who had a pin, a button that said "End segregation now." And man, it was a big word. I didn't know what it meant. And so I went home. I went home and I asked my mom, and I saw the look on her face when I asked her, what is segregation? It's like just all the energy just like left her body, man, because she realized at this particular moment that she was going to have to break down the whole thing.
Wow.
That she that she had been able to shield me from a great deal of it.
Wow.
And she laid it out to me. She said, well, she said that, she had to explain that, there are some white people in this country, who don't like to be around black people, for whatever reason. They feel that it detracts from their existence or from their lives, and that they feel that the farther apart and the farther away from us that they are, that the better their life is, and it's because of the hatred, that they feel from us, and it goes all the way back to to slavery, and that we just the act of our asserting ourselves and asserting the fact that we deserve the same rights, which is obvious to us that we deserve the same rights as every other American, incenses them, and it makes them angry, and it makes them want to distance themselves from us even farther. And further, that segregation was a way for them to keep the advantages that they had, because even though there was and I began to understand later that even though there was such a thing as separate but equal, the separate part was working very well, but the equal part was far below par, as it intended to be. It's another one of those catchphrases that has never really lived up. When I was 11 years old, which is the time period that you just mentioned, I was part of a church called Siloam Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, in Bed-Stuy, and it was run by a brother named Milton Glamison. He was the pastor there, and there were a few activist clergymen, in New York at that time. Probably one of the most famous was Adam Clayton Powell. Well, Reverend Glamison was a contemporary of Adam Clayton Powell. I don't know if they knew each other. I'm pretty sure they did. But during that time period, he organized a boycott. I was 11, going on 12 years old at the time. The thing is that during that time period, this is pre-Civil Rights Bill, okay? And, the kind of the scent was in the air, if you will. There was a change coming. Segregation was about to be outlawed. And even though there was no segregation per se, there were no Jim Crow laws per se in New York City, there was still a lot of compartmentalism.
But right now we're talking early 60s right now, like 60,
Early
61.
60s.
So when you
That's right.
recall being in Brooklyn and are going into the city, and there was like no segregated diners or anything that you would see?
No, there was nothing like that,
Okay.
but there were still places that you couldn't go.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There were still neighborhoods that you didn't want to go,
Yeah.
that you didn't want to go in.
Got you.
And you definitely knew where you were accepted and where you might have some some trouble.
But
some bad vibes.
before you even go on past this is something I always talk about with people your age and older, Black people. I spoke with Lonnie Liston Smith about this when he was over here recording, and I was like, "Yo, man, what was that like?" And you know what the consistent answer has been for me, like around people that was around your age, around 11.
Tell me, I'm curious.
It's that they were pretty oblivious to it because they were just raised in a good home, and you just didn't really notice a lot of things.
Exactly. Exactly. Like I told you.
Yeah.
When we had our conversation previously, that I was like about 11, around that same time period, when I saw somebody with a button that said "No segregation,"
Right.
End segregation now. That's what it said.
Yeah.
I had to go home and ask my mom, what is segregation?
Right.
I didn't know what it was.
So then you're at this church, and then what happens?
So he organizes a school boycott. All the Black kids in New York City were encouraged to be a part of this boycott. The reason being that in our communities where we ordinarily should have had control over the schools, we didn't. You know, they were districted in such a way that we never made up a majority enough so that we could be control the school boards of our district.
Wow.
And Reverend Galamison was like, you know what? If we can't control our own schools for our own children, then we're not going to send our children to those schools. And so he organized this boycott, which I was a part of. My mother encouraged me, you know, like to be a part of it, and many of my friends, and many black kids in various communities were encouraged to do the same. And it did work. It did work to some degree.
You know, that's pretty heavy, because me being a father, if there were discriminatory practices going on at my children's school, and other parents and other luminaries within the community asked me not to send my kids to school to boycott, it would have to be a big, major decision for me to say yes or no. So it just shows how important it was for that. So then what power did the community receive?
Well, the community received, I would say, token power. You know, because the overarching control belonged to the Department of Education.
Yes.
Belonged to the superintendent of schools.
Yes.
You know, and so as in many things during that period, concessions were made, and then quickly, or maybe not quickly, but kind of under the table, snatched back. So that now you go to New York, and you will still see the same type of segregation within the school system. Because the schools within the black neighborhoods are still, in many cases, far less equipped than schools in the more wealthy neighborhoods.
So they're far less equipped because there was a separate but equal thing. But by that time, in the early 60s, the schools were integrated. But the issue is what kind of funds were actually allocated to the schools that weren't necessarily integrated. But who controlled those schools were the white men that decided to allocate resources here versus there. So it was still this continuance of a separate but equal under operation of law.
Well, let me give you an example. In New York, I mean, you wouldn't think that it was necessary in New York to have busing, right?
Right.
You would think that would be something that would happen in Tennessee, you know, or Alabama.
Yeah.
But I was bused.
Wow.
Why? Because my mother wanted to make sure that I received the resources that all of the resources that were available in the public education system were available to me.
Wow.
And what happened after I went to high school? Well, my mother knew somebody who lived in Flatbush, and I used their address during the entirety of my high school career because of that fact. Because the option for me living in Crown Heights was to go to a school that was far inferior.
Wow.
To the school that I ended up at. And I'll go a step farther and say that my 18-year-old and 21-year-old daughters, I had to use the address of my dad, you know, who lived in Brooklyn Heights, to avoid having them go to schools with the same resource problem that we were fighting against in the 60s.
Wow. So when I look back, you and Gil, you guys met in college. And when I think back, right, because you guys are absolutely viewed as luminaries of the time. You guys are looked at as some of the forefathers of hip hop. But conversely, when you look at your young self, when you look at your 19-year-old self, do you find holes in your philosophy at that time? Or do you feel as though your foundation was exactly where it needed to be and you're just wiser now? Like, what's your retrospective analysis of your political faults at that time, if there were even any?
Well, I think that, let me just share this with you. This is something
Go
that
for
I
it.
just realized. I've been telling people for years that when I recorded Pieces of a Man, I was 19 years old. And I had forgotten when we actually recorded Pieces of a Man, but it was actually in April 1971. In reality,
That's a month before
because
What's Going On came out.
it's a month. Yeah. That's interesting, right?
Right.
My birthday is in October. So in reality, I hadn't yet turned 19. I was 18 years old when I recorded that, man, which is, just even a year crazier.
It's interesting.
But when I was 18, man, I had a lot of holes in my consciousness, brother.
Yeah.
I was still in disbelief at how I just told you that it wasn't until I was 11 years old that I found out what segregation was. And I thought about this, man. I was 12 years old when the bombings in Birmingham happened.
Wow.
I was 13 when Malcolm was killed.
Wow.
I was 16 when Dr. King was assassinated. 17 when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed. And when the students at Kent State and Jackson State were gunned down. So there was that.
How did that resonate with youth culture, Black youth culture at the time? Like, is this because, see, something right now that's happening is that with the murder of George Floyd, younger people have had to face the nuances of racism and discrimination in an entirely different way than generations, or than a few generations before, because
Absolutely.
it has now been the biggest civil rights movement at one time around the world. So with my daughters, I'd have to talk about it, and when all this was happening, when you were growing up, what did you and your friends discuss?
Man, we were mad. We were hot mad. We just wanted to just tear the whole thing down and start over again or not.
Wow.
But I had to watch. It just pisses me off even now just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But, I would have to turn on the news, or my grandmother or my mom, they would turn on CBS News. And I would have to sit there and watch some people as young as me, often, marching just for the right to vote, or just for the right to order a milkshake at a local restaurant, being hosed with fire hose up against the wall, and then beaten, and then bitten by dogs, and then arrested. And I had to watch that on the news every day, people looking like me, that happening to, knowing that there were only a couple of 1,000 miles difference between that happening to them and that happening to me. And it pissed me off, man. It just really, I was enraged, man. And I had no way, I had to find an outlet for it. I think that's what writing poetry and playing music helped me with. It was my form of therapy.
Wow. It's deep, man, because again, music, I always tell people that I live life as if music is way more important to me than it should be. But when you actually think about it and analyze it, it is therapeutic. It's communication. It tells people how to live. It allows us to identify with our consciousness. It changes the world. It changes the way people see life and see us. It is one of those things that has put us on a level playing field when it comes to understanding our intelligence understanding our value as human beings. So it is important. And when I think about your sweets of lasting value, I think about how you help to inspire generations of Black musicians telling it like it is, of Black musicians helping to change federal policy on our journey to freedom. And now that we're talking about hip hop, your debut, Piece of a Man, came out in 71. Y'all from New York. The birth of hip hop is 73, the Bronx. How close were you to this movement in New York at that time?
1973, that was we had already moved to Washington, D.C. full time.
Got
So, I mean, I used to come up to visit my mom, you know, and my stepfather, but really spent a lot of time down in D.C. Writing, composing for the album Winter in America.
Wow.
I kind of lived in a bubble during that time. You know, I mean, I listened to some music, I would listen to jams and stuff, but I kind of was totally engrossed in this project that we were doing that eventually became Winter in America. So when you talk about the birth of hip hop being around 1973, the first thing that comes to my mind is, I guess that has to be two branches shooting forth from the same tree. Yeah, you know, coming from the same roots, but branching out in slightly different directions.
I see. And then you guys being in DC doing your thing. And then also around that time in DC, Go-Go was kind of starting, you know, so you had the Soul Searchers, all that stuff. But like, you guys always had your own lane. And I think about how music would be different if our culture did not learn how to postulate certain messages. Messages just like the revolution will not be televised, which is an absolutely profound one. You know, people love this song, but a lot of people don't really understand its meaning. Can you confirm the intent behind the music and what the purpose of this revolution actually was/is?
During the time period that we were talking about, we were seeing the birth of the engineering of consent. Okay, you will know that from the writings of Edward Bernays, who is a nephew of Sigmund Freud, who basically used psychology to understand and manipulate the minds of people, generally addressing the public, generally addressing their feelings of inadequacy, their fears, you know, and their need to belong and their need to be better, you know, than their neighbors. Kind of some of the worst tendencies of human existence. They basically played on them. So a whole industry was born around creating products that we didn't need, but we were manipulated psychologically into believing that we did need them.
You're saying that Americans were manipulated into believing that they needed something that they didn't need, like certain property, which is analogous to our captured ancestors being forced to serve the white man in the Western. Okay, I got it. I see where you're going, but go ahead.
I like how you did that. Yeah. So here we are in the 60s. Madison Avenue is in full swing. But prior to that whole era, you know, did we need products to make our underarms smell good? You know, or did we need Old Spice to splash on, you know, on our sweaty necks? You know, um, did we need olive green refrigerators? You know, no,
Yeah.
we didn't need any of
Yeah.
that stuff, man. But but by the time Madison Avenue was finished with us, okay, we felt that we needed it. And not only did we feel that we needed it, we felt that these were the keys to the change that we all envisioned,
Mm.
you know? I mean, because if we could achieve all of these things, if we could have all of these things, then we could find this utopia that we all dreamed about,
Wow.
all through products.
Wow. So then, if that song was an ode against commercialism, how did you feel when Nike co-opted the song in
Bruh.
'94 for the commercial that they had with KRS-One, where he reinterpreted the lyrics to make an ode to basketball in order to promote new Nikes? I think they were Jordans.
Man,
How did you feel about that when you saw that?
would you believe that I had never seen that?
Really?
I hadn't seen that until you sent me the link to it, man.
Wow.
And I was like, wow.
Wow.
I was flabbergasted, man. I was like, no, not KRS-One, man.
Wow.
No.
Wow. Because when I was researching and I saw that, it's something that I forgot about. And then when I watched it, it made me go back to that time. From a hip hop standpoint, it made a lot of musical sense because you guys are just venerable luminaries for our generation. And then KRS it's as if they're just sampling y'all and interpolating the lyrics, but it's literally to sell a product. So, how do you like?
Let me give you a story.
Go
Okay?
for it.
Let me give you a story. Around the time that Bridges came out, which was about 1976, we would often go to record stores. Back in those days, artists used to travel when they were in town to do a show. They'd stop by the local record stores, sign a few albums, make an appearance. A lot of times the local DJ would be there and, just try to hype some things up for not only for the upcoming show, but also for the label and for the record store, kind of like a book signing, And so we were at this store and it must have been maybe about 2 or 3 years ago. I got an email from one of these store owners, one of the guys who had been managing one of these stores. And he had a picture. And as you know, on our album Bridges, there was a song called Wild Golia. And in parentheses, it says deaf, dumb, and blind. Okay. And so the picture was of me and Gil next to a poster of Bridges, an Arista ad for Bridges. And one of us holding our hands over our eyes, one of us over our mouth, and the other one over our ears, deaf, dumb, and blind, three monkeys. So I'm looking at this picture and I just I kind of zoomed in on it to see what the poster said. I was curious, what did the poster say? And here's what the poster said. There's another song on that album called Delta Man. And probably one of the strongest lines of the song was, put a little revolution in your life. All right. And so the label had taken this line from the song as part of the ad. And so I looked at the ad and here's how it presented. Put a little revolution in your life. And then underneath it said $10.99. $10.99. And everything just like totally crystallized for me at that moment. What I'm trying to say is that no artist is immune, from being commercialized or anything that they are trying to get across.
Absolutely. It's like, just like I said earlier, Archie Shepp said, They own the music, we make it. And when I talk about this concept of freedom through sound, you got to separate the art from the product, right?
Yes.
So my thing is, I always think about what it means to license your music as a musician, obviously, and when not to do it, when to do it. But
Mm.
how important is just the message, you know? I
Mm.
think that the revolution that will now be televised and a myriad of other tracks that you guys created, the purpose is to communicate. And then if they got to sell something while they communicate, did the communication get across? You know what I'm saying? Like that's
Exactly right.
just what it is.
That's exactly
In the
right.
Nike situation, it's a little different because they changed the communication to say that basketball is the actual revolution. You know, so they're literally commercializing the hell out of it, but at least that probably took people to the original song and it helped to immortalize the original. Because when hip
I
hop
totally
does
believe
that,
that.
the real song is always the sample joint. So
That's right. It is the message. Like Marshall McLuhan said, you know, the medium, the medium is the message. And, you know, I always kind of focus on that because in particular with our music, because at some point I was conscious of the medium, you know, and I understood that perhaps a different form of the music that we were doing could reach more people, you know, whereas Madison Avenue used it in a mercenary way, you know, we used it in a, I don't know, for want of a better word, a missionary way. we were trying to convey a message through your feet, you know, through your hands clapping, you know, through anything that moved you as an African person to get the message. And this is also the tradition of the griot.
when it comes to the message, I think about the kind of music that exemplified Black excellence when you were coming up. So thinking about music by Max Roach, Horace Silver, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Art Blakey, Coltrane, you know.
Oh yeah.
When I
Yeah,
think
man.
about how they ingrained this level of Black consciousness, how they created a message with their sound, it takes me to how much the music represented an indictment against America. And I also think about how the message was received and how the message wasn't received. And I want to speak more particularly to bebop. So, you know, Black musicians at the time were really incensed that white performers had been reaping the cream of the benefits from a Black invention, which was swing music. And when we talk about the king of swing, we're not talking about Count Basie. We're talking about Benny Goodman. We're talking about the white guys that were traveling, making all the money at the big events, and us not making nothing. And after swing, you know, we're getting into post-World War II. We were supposed to be fighting a fight for ethnic equality, but we were still facing the same kind of discrimination here at home, even though we're going over there to fight for what we believe in. And then our culture, we created a type of music that was rebellious, a type of music that white people couldn't play, and that's bebop. It was like a systemic pattern of distortion that was created and understood by those that are Black literate. And when I think of this Black literacy or understanding Black culture, I think about the long-standing tradition in jazz where Black artists suffer from being misinterpreted by white journalists of their day. They really maintain this position of having custody over the interpretation of Black music to the masses, somewhat establishing the mythology and or legacy of an artist's work, whether or not they understand it. Now, I'm not saying this from the standpoint that there are not great white journalists, because some of my favorite journalists are white journalists. But there are white journalists that didn't grow up in the atmosphere that created the pressure for the music, and therefore have a problem interpreting it. Then they'll say it's whack, and then they'll put that in whatever magazine, and then it'll take away from the career of the artist. So I say this all to ask the question, did you and Gil ever suffer from white misinterpretation from a journalistic and or political level? And if so, is there any examples that you can remember?
First of all, you have to understand that nobody had anything on us. We had no aspirations beyond getting our music out. You know, whether one person bought it or a million, we really didn't care, man. We didn't care at all. If these guys didn't understand, if someone didn't understand our music, we didn't care, you know, because we knew that we were speaking in code. We knew that our music was code. You talk about bebop, you know, we already talked about the slave song. We already talked about songs like Steal Away, you know, like in the spiritual tradition. We already talked about how much of Black music revolved around the hidden message, and not the one that is on that you hear on the surface. So it was kind of cool to us, and it was kind of effective.
Wow.
You know, it kind of gave us an idea that we were being effective when some of those critics didn't understand, because that meant that they were going to let it go through, that it was going to get through, because the people who were going to hear it were the people who we were trying to get to.
Wow. My whole thing is that with critics, their job is to enhance a person's appreciation of the music when it comes to
ostensibly
to our music, right? And they should illuminate something with substance instead of making like flagrantly fallacious opinions affecting those that aren't in the know. Because I'll ask you this, how many heavy metal critics are there that are Black and from Compton? You know what I'm saying? So I'll kind of leave that at that, you know.
Okay,
so
yeah, I think,
you know, I mean, we'll move on. So something I talk about a lot in this podcast is my struggle with my own relationship to the motherland, which is Africa, because I have no modern ties to this land, right? You know, there's a part of me that feels defeated because I've traveled to many places around the world and I have yet to go to Africa, which is our birthplace, the genesis of humankind. And, you know, I'm planning to go in the very, very near future. But this is a type of trip that is so important to me. You know, I'd have to bring my friends, my family. Like, I can't just go to go. So in 75, you and Gil released Johannesburg, which served as an indictment against apartheid in South Africa. How connected did you feel to Africa at that time? And how connected do you feel 40 odd years later?
Well, you would think that we would have been able to travel to Africa, as particularly South Africa, after that song. But it wasn't until 23 years later that we actually got the opportunity. And it was both of our first times in Africa.
Wow.
And when I got off the plane, man, at the airport, I got down on my knees and I kissed the ground, brother.
Wow.
And so many brothers there, you know, and sisters, you know, they said to me, so how does it feel to be home? You know, it was like one of the most memorable experiences and emotional experiences of my life. But our consciousness of what was going on in South Africa was kind of like that same kind of gunshot moment as when I saw the button that said that, you know, that said end segregation now, because at Lincoln University, there were two brothers from South Africa. One was Black and one was colored. And their perspectives, although different, were upsettingly the same, you know. And I think that the colored brother was named Derek, and the black brother who was named Zola. It was good for them to talk to each other as well, and we learned a lot from their interaction with each other. And Zola showed me pictures of his family, and Derek showed me pictures of his family. And when I looked at the pictures, it's interesting because I could look at the pictures of both of their families and see people who could have been my family.
Wow.
And, you know, it's always those kinds of situations when you realize how connected you are. As I saw, and I mean, connection, I guess, has always been an important thing to me because it's the same kind of feeling that I had when I saw those protesters in the South being hosed and beaten and bitten by a dog. I mean, when I looked at those black and colored people in South Africa, and I saw that they could be me. That could be me. You know, it kind of opened me up to something that I've kind of held on to since then. It's the realization that we are all connected. This is probably the thing that I try now to show in my music. And I feel that wherever we go, that's my goal. My goal is for everyone to understand that we are connected, and that one of the greatest mediums or ways that we can find that connection is through music.
Music connects culture. Music is a language. I always say that there's no greater study of Black culture than just listening to their music. And in understanding the nuances of racism, in understanding why bigotry is so wrong, you think about that could be me. And it's having that humility on both sides to understand that the aggressor can have empathy. It's understanding that the aggressor many times does not necessarily understand the history that got us here. So when you teach people, like you have taught people with music, they start to get a better understanding that we are just human beings. I always say race is a social construct. We
Absolutely.
are merely human beings.
Absolutely.
And when we talk about freedom, you realize that slavery was here before our concept of democracy was. You should realize that. So slavery is more American than the Constitution. So when people ask why the era of slavery matters, we say it matters because it's so connected to what we are experiencing right now. We want them to see that this could be them. The great music that you created is as fresh as it was 40, 50 years ago because we are still suffering from injustice. We are still reprimanded for asking for equality, often being mistaken as asking for inequality since many whites can't see the problem. Many whites are intransigent to the vestige of the slave codes. But it's impossible to explain when America continually revises its past with the sensationalized concept of freedom. Our music helps to change that. You have dedicated your life to helping both sides see the problem. Your music is essential. Your music exudes freedom. Your music inspires me to be more like you. As you live what you speak, we are forever indebted to your musical voice. And I'd like to thank you for being Brian Jackson. Much love to you, and thank you for being on Invisible Blackness.
Thank you, my brother.
I think that there's no better way to close this episode but to have our song, right? Because we have an album coming out on Jazz is Dead. We have a single out called Mars Walk. So let's close with Mars Walk, man.
Love you, brother. Thank you,
Love
man.
you too.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
man. All right.
Thank you.
Peace. Hey, y'all. This is Brian Jackson, and you're listening to Invisible Blackness.